Prolonged touch deprivation can increase stress hormones by 25%. But what happens when the most feared person in the room is the one who is silently, severely starving? This is the story of a war-torn king and a single, gentle touch that shattered a decade of isolation. We are examining a silent epidemic that preys on those we consider invincible: leaders, soldiers, survivors. For them, a hand on the shoulder isn't just comfort, it's a radical, terrifying act of trust. So what occurs when that final defense cracks, not from an enemy's blade, but from a simple, sustained human kindness? The answer lies in a forgotten infirmary and a king who returned from battle with wounds that weren't all on the surface. His name was Kalen, and for 10 years, his reign was built on a single, unbreakable commandment: fear. He was the Alpha King, a title earned not through birthright, but through the brutal, unrelenting conquest of 7 rival territories. His court was one of steel and silence, a fortress where loyalty was measured in blood oaths and where the concept of comfort was seen as a fatal weakness. He was a sovereign of absolute control, and his body, scarred from 100 battles, was a map of his ruthlessness. But control is a fragile illusion. The northern border wars, a conflict over rich timberlands that had simmered for a generation, finally erupted into total war. Kalen led the campaign himself. For 17 months, he lived in the mud and blood of the front lines. There was no gentle contact there, only the jarring clash of weapons, the rough hands of field medics stitching wounds without anesthetic, and the heavy, impersonal grips of soldiers hauling each other from the fray. The war was a masterpiece of tactical brutality. Kalen's forces were victorious, but the cost was hidden, etched not just on the land, but into the king's own nervous system. He returned to the stone capital not as a celebrated hero, but as a contained storm of trauma. His convoy, a line of armored vehicles caked in frost and dried earth, passed through the towering gates under a blanket of silent snow. The people lined the streets, but they did not cheer. They bowed, faces pressed to the ground, gripped by the overwhelming, predatory aura that rolled off their king, an aura now sharpened by recent killing, vibrating with a pain he could not name. He did not acknowledge them. His pale skin was stretched tight over the stark bones of his face, his long dark hair matted with sweat and grime. Beneath his travel cloak, a network of deep, poorly healed wounds crossed his chest and arms, some still seeping because Kalen had refused to stay in the field hospital. To him, vulnerability was the one defeat he would not permit. The court healers, a team of 6 seasoned veterans, awaited him in the palace's great hall. He strode in, shrugging off his cloak to reveal the brutal extent of his injuries. The head physician, an older man named Alaric, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we must treat these immediately. Risk of infection is—" Kalen's voice was a low rasp like stone grinding on stone. "You will not touch me." The command was absolute. It wasn't pride. It was a reflex, a deep-seated physiological recall. After years of violence, his body interpreted all unknown touch as a potential attack. Alaric pleaded, "The wounds must be cleaned and sutured, sire. The muscle tissue is torn. Without proper care, you could lose mobility or worse." Kalen's gold-flecked eyes, hollow with exhaustion, swept over the assembled healers. He saw their skill, but he also saw their barely concealed terror, the minute trembling of their hands, the quick, shallow breaths. Their fear was a pollutant. It would taint the process. To be touched by someone who feared you was just another form of violence. "Get out," he said, the finality in the tone leaving no room for debate. The great hall emptied, leaving the king alone in the cavernous space, standing before a dead hearth. For 3 days he sequestered himself in his private chambers. He attempted to tend to his own wounds, a near-impossible task that resulted in torn stitches and increased inflammation. Fever set in. The pain was a constant, screaming companion, but it was a familiar one. It was the other ache, a cold, hollow vacuum in the center of his chest, that was maddening. This was the touch starvation, the silent debt of a decade of isolation, now demanding payment with interest. On the 4th day, his beater, a steadfast man named Roderick, made a desperate decision. He bypassed the court physicians and went down into the city's lower quarter, to a small, unmarked clinic known only to those who could not afford the palace's care. There, he found Ilara. She was an Omega healer, mid-20s, with a calm that seemed to emanate from her like warmth from a stone left in the sun. She did not look at Roderick's insignia of office. She listened to the description of the wounds, the fever, the king's refusal. She gathered her kit, simple, clean tools, herbal poultices, fresh linen, and followed him without a word. She was brought not to the throne room, but to a dimly lit infirmary chamber in the palace's oldest wing, a room of stone and shadow. Kalen was there, sitting on a bare wooden bench, shirtless in the cold air. The candlelight danced over the horrific landscape of his injuries, the deep gashes, the bruising that colored his skin in shades of storm and rot, the tension in every corded muscle as he held himself upright through sheer will. Roderick announced her quietly and then retreated, shutting the heavy door. The Alpha King lifted his head. His gaze, burning with fever and defiance, locked onto Ilara. He expected to see the same fear. The same trembling. He prepared to roar at her to leave, but Ilara simply met his eyes. There was no fear there, no awe, just a quiet, focused assessment. She did not bow. She set her kit down on a table with a soft click, rolled up the sleeves of her dark linen dress and approached. She stopped just outside his personal space, a distance of respect, not subservience. "The wounds are infected," she stated, her voice clear and even. "The fever is your body fighting a losing battle. You need to let me help." Kalen snarled, a weak, rasping sound. "I do not need your help." "You are correct," she replied, surprising him. "You do not need it. You are the Alpha King. You could choose to die of stubbornness on this bench and no one could stop you." She paused, her eyes softening just a degree. "But that would be a very stupid way for a legend to end." She then did something incomprehensible. She turned her back to him. She walked to the basin, poured water from a pitcher, and began washing her hands with methodical care. The casual dismissal of his threat, the utter normality of the action, it created a crack in the king's formidable defenses. The tension in the room shifted from hostile to perplexed. When she turned back, her hands were clean and steady. She approached again, and this time she knelt before him on the stone floor, placing her at eye level with his worst injury, a gash that ran from his collarbone down across his pectoral muscle. She did not ask permission again. She simply reached out. Her fingers, warm from the water, made contact with the skin beside the wound. It was not a grab, not a clinical probe. It was the lightest, most deliberate touch, a preliminary assessment of the fever's heat and the wound's edges. Kalen flinched. A violent, full-body jerk, his hand coming up as if to strike. But Ilara did not pull back. She did not gasp. She held her fingers there, her touch constant and gentle, and waited. The king's breath hitched. His raised hand trembled in the air, then slowly lowered back to his side. His entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. A decade of isolation. 10 years of hands that only touched him to harm, to arm, or to kneel in submission. 10 years without a single gesture of unguarded, compassionate human contact. The psychology is clear. When the nervous system is locked in a perpetual state of threat, gentle, predictable touch acts as a neurological override. It signals safety. For Kalen, whose entire adulthood had been a monument to danger, that signal was a cataclysm. Ilara, unaware of the earthquake she had just triggered, carefully began to clean the wound. Her movements were confident, efficient, and impossibly soft. She was focused on the task, her brow slightly furrowed, her breathing even. She was not handling a king, she was treating a patient. And then, as she blotted away the last of the old, corrupted ointment, her thumb brushed just once against a patch of unbroken skin near his shoulder. A simple, unintentional stroke. It was the final, silent blow. Kalen, the fearsome Alpha King, the conqueror of nations, felt something warm and wet trail down his cheek. He was not undone by the pain of the needle that would soon suture his flesh. He was shattered by the devastating, simple realization that this was the first gentle touch he had felt in 10 years. The tear was a breach in the dam, not of sorrow, but of a system failure. For Kalen, it was a physiological glitch his body could not compute. He did not weep. He simply sat, paralyzed, as a single trail of moisture betrayed a decade of flawless armor. In the silent infirmary, the only sound was the soft crackle of candle flame and the king's own ragged, confused breath. Ilara did not acknowledge it. Her clinical focus never wavered. She continued her work, her hands moving with a steady, rhythmical precision that was itself a form of communication, a language of non-threatening, predictable motion that his trauma-starved nervous system could begin, against its will, to trust. She cleaned, she applied a poultice of honey and antiseptic herbs, and she began to suture. The needle pierced his flesh. He felt the tug of the thread, but the dominant sensation was not pain. It was the warmth of her fingers resting against his skin to steady her work, a point of anchoring heat in the cold room. His mind, a strategist's mind accustomed to mapping threats and alliances, was now mapping this unfamiliar territory. The gentle pressure of a fingertip, the absence of a tremble, the sheer, unthinkable normalcy of it. When she finished the first wound, she sat back on her heels and finally looked at his face. Her eyes were calm, brown, and held no pity. Pity would have broken the spell. The fever will break within hours if the infection is contained, she said, her voice matter of fact. The muscle damage is significant. You will need to rest. You will need to be redressed tomorrow and the day after that. Kalen found his voice, but it was unrecognizable to him, stripped of command. You are not afraid. It wasn't a question. It was a bewildered observation. Ilara considered this as she cleaned her needle. Fear is a luxury in my profession, she said. It makes hands shake. It clouds judgment. My task is to heal. Your title is irrelevant to that task. This statement, so simple and yet so revolutionary in his world, hung in the air. To her, he was not a king in that moment. He was a patient. And in that downgrading, he found a shocking, profound form of respect. He was being seen not as a symbol, but as a human body that was broken. For the first time in memory, he did not have to perform. The revelation was as destabilizing as the touch. She completed her work in silence, dressing the wounds with clean linen. When she was done, she packed her kit and stood. Rest, she instructed, as if speaking to any stubborn patient. I will return at dawn. She turned to leave. Panic, sharp and animal, lanced through him. It wasn't about the wounds. It was about the silence returning. The cold emptiness of the room rushing back in once her calming presence was gone. Your name, he rasped, the words clawing their way out. She paused at the door. Ilara. And then she was gone. The king was left alone with the ghost of her touch on his skin and a silence that was now deafening. The hour that followed was a silent crisis. The physical pain had receded, replaced by a psychological vertigo. The dam was not just breached, it was gone. Memories, long buried under layers of discipline and duty, surfaced, not of war but of before. A hand on his shoulder from a father long dead. The brush of his mother's hand over his hair as a child. The casual, trusting contact of a friend from a life erased by crowns and conquests. He had amputated these memories to survive his own rise. Now, with a single touch, Ilara had reattached the limb, and the phantom pain was excruciating. He was feeling, truly feeling, for the first time in a decade, and it was a more terrifying battlefield than any he had commanded. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, rumors were born in whispers. The beater, Roderick, had been waiting outside. He had seen Ilara leave, her expression unchanged. He entered the infirmary to find his king shirtless, bandaged, and staring at the wall with a look of shattered concentration. Sire. Roderick ventured, expecting a roar, a dismissal, anything but this eerie quiet. Kalen's eyes focused slowly. She returns at dawn, he said, his voice hollow. She is to be admitted, without question, without obstruction. Roderick bowed, hiding his astonishment. It will be done. The news spread through the palace's nervous system faster than any official decree. The Alpha King, who had banished his own court physicians, had allowed an unknown Omega from the lower quarter to treat him. And he had summoned her back. In the physicians' quarters, Alaric seethed with a mixture of professional insult and political fear. His authority was undermined. But more than that, he sensed a weakness, a crack in the king's invincibility. He confided in the chancellor, a man named Vorian, whose loyalty was to the stability of the realm, which he equated with the king's unchallenged, fearsome power. This is a vulnerability, Vorian murmured, stroking his beard. If the king becomes dependent on some common healer, it becomes a lever, and levers can be pulled by enemies. The political calculus had begun. The king's moment of human need was instantly translated into a vector of threat. At dawn, Ilara returned. The guards at the postern gate, under Roderick's orders, let her pass with a silent nod. The palace staff watched her, a plain figure with a simple kit, walking through the marbled halls as if she belonged there. The atmosphere was charged with a new kind of tension, not fear of the king's wrath, but fear of the unknown change she represented. She found Kalen in the same infirmary. He was sitting upright, having slept little. The fever had lessened as she predicted. She went to work without ceremony, checking the dressings. Her touch was the same, professional, gentle, assured. This time, Kalen was prepared for the impact, and yet he was. The second touch was not a shock, but a confirmation. It sparked a craving. His body, understanding on some primal level what it had been denied, now screamed for this specific input. The oxytocin release, the bonding hormone suppressed for years, flooded his system not as a warm glow, but as a disorienting wave. He had to consciously stop himself from leaning into her hand. The inflammation is reduced, Ilara noted, her head bent close to his chest as she examined a wound. She was so close he could smell the scent of her, soap, lavender, and something green and alive. It was clean, it was safe. It was everything the metallic, bloody scent of his world was not. "Who are you?" he asked, the question escaping him. She looked up, meeting his eyes from mere inches away. "I told you, Ilara. That is a name, it is not an answer." She sat back, studying him. She saw not a king now, but the profound isolation behind his eyes. The question wasn't about her pedigree. It was a plea from a man lost in a desert, asking a single oasis how it came to be. "I am a healer," she said slowly, choosing her words. "My parents were healers in the border villages. They were killed when I was young, not in war, but in a raid from a pack your forces later disbanded. I learned that pain is impartial. It comes for kings and paupers, and so should care." She had, with a few sentences, reframed his entire worldview. Conquests, his grand strategies, were abstract monuments. Her reality was the collateral damage, the orphan left behind. And yet she held no accusation in her tone. It was a simple fact. In offering him care, she was embodying a principle his reign had never considered: mercy without weakness. She finished redressing the wounds. "You will need to move the arm today, gently, or the tissue will scar and bind." As she gathered her things to leave, the panic returned to him sharper. "The pain, it is manageable," he said, clumsily trying to create a reason for her to stay. She paused, understanding the subtext. The unspoken plea, "Don't go." She looked at the powerful man before her, reduced to a boy afraid of the dark. Her expression softened, not into pity but into a decision. "The body holds trauma," she said quietly, "not just in wounds, in the muscles, in the breath. The healing of the flesh is the easiest part." She placed her kit back down. "Sit forward." Bewildered, he obeyed. She moved behind the bench. "Close your eyes and just breathe." Then her hands settled on his shoulders, not to treat, not to assess, simply to rest there, a solid, warm weight. It was not a medical touch. It was human contact, pure and simple. Kalen's breath shuddered out of him. Every instinct told him to tense, to reject this unprecedented vulnerability. But a deeper, starved instinct won out. He let his head bow forward. Her thumbs gently pressed into the knotted muscles of his shoulders, not massaging, just acknowledging the tension held there. For 5 minutes they stayed like that, the Alpha King and the Omega Healer, in a silent communion of touch. In that space, the hierarchy of the palace, the scheming of the court, the weight of the crown, it all dissolved. He was just a man, and he was not alone. When she removed her hands, the cold that rushed in felt like a new kind of loss. She left without another word. The effect of that session radiated outward like a shockwave. Kalen, following her instruction, left the infirmary. He walked the palace grounds. Guards and servants bowed, but he saw their sideways glances, their whispered exchanges. The rumor was now a living thing. The king was changed. He was quieter. His terrifying aura was still present, but it was now layered with something unpredictable. In the council chamber that afternoon, a meeting was held on border security. Kalen listened as his generals advocated for a punitive raid on a neighboring faction for a minor transgression, a show of strength to cement the recent victory. The old Kalen would have approved it without hesitation. The new Kalen, whose shoulders still hummed with the memory of a gentle touch, saw only the cycle of violence. The raid would create more orphans like Ilara. It would create more broken men like himself. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the war plans. The room froze. Chancellor Vorian leaned forward. "Sire, a show of weakness now could invite further aggression." Kalen met his gaze. "Is strength only proven by causing pain? We will increase border patrols. We will send diplomats. We will not raid." The decision was a tectonic shift in policy. It was interpreted not as wisdom, but as infirmity. The crack was widening. Vorian and Alaric convened in secret that night. "It is the healer," Alaric insisted. "She is softening him, making him weak." "A king cannot afford to be gentle." Vorian, the political animal, saw further. "It is not about gentleness. It is about influence. Who holds the king's ear? Who has access to him in a state of vulnerability? We do not, she does. That makes her the most powerful person in the kingdom, and she doesn't even know it." A plan was formed, not a direct attack that would risk the king's wrath. A subtle political maneuver. They would discredit the source of the change. They would unearth any scandal, any flaw in Ilara's past. They would make the king see that his oasis was a mirage, poisoned. The very next day, as Ilara arrived for her third session, she was intercepted not by Roderick, but by two stern-faced chamberlains. "You are to come with us," one said. "The Chancellor has questions regarding your credentials and your background." Ilara, her healer's kit in hand, simply nodded. She was led not to the infirmary, but to a stark, windowless antechamber used for interrogating suspicious petitioners. Vorian was there, along with Alaric. The confrontation had begun. The antechamber was a cage of stone and suspicion. Chancellor Vorian did not offer Ilara a seat. He stood, flanked by the frowning physician Alaric, and placed his hands flat on the cold table between them. "Your methods are unorthodox," Vorian began, his voice slick with false courtesy. "An Omega treating the Alpha King without formal training from the royal colleges. It raises questions of propriety and of safety." Ilara stood calmly, her healer's kit still in her hand. "The wounds are healing, the fever broke. Are those not the only metrics that matter?" Alaric scoffed. "We have only your word for that, and we have reports. You operate a clinic in the lower quarter. You treat rogues, you treat humans, you have no pack allegiance." Vorian leaned forward. "Loyalty, girl, is the first medicine a king requires. Your background is a shadow. Your parents were village healers, yes, killed in a raid. A raid by the Black Fang Pack. A pack the king destroyed 3 years ago in the Eastern Campaign." He let that hang, a twisted implication slithering into the room. One might wonder about the loyalty of a daughter treating the man who, however justly, created the orphans of her enemies. It was a masterful, poisonous insinuation. They were not accusing her of malice, but of an inherent, subconscious conflict of interest. It was designed to plant a seed of doubt in Kaelin's mind. Ilara's calm finally fractured, but not in the way they expected. Her eyes flashed with a cold, clear anger. "You think healing is transactional?" she asked, her quiet voice cutting through the political fog. "You think care is a currency spent only on allies? My parents died because they stayed to heal the wounded of both sides during that raid. They believed pain had no faction. I believe that too. If that makes me disloyal to your narrow idea of a kingdom, then I am guilty." Her defiance was the wrong tactic. It confirmed their fear that she was not controllable, that her principles were stronger than their politics. Vorian's expression hardened. "Your audience with the king is terminated. You will leave the palace grounds and not return. Your services are no longer required." At that moment, the door to the antechamber shuddered on its hinges, not from a knock, but from a heavy, deliberate impact. Before anyone could move, it swung inward. Kaelin stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple tunic, his hair still damp from washing, but his presence filled the space with a palpable electric pressure. His eyes, that chilling amber, went first to Ilara, ensuring she was unharmed, then settled on Vorian. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Explain," the king said, the single word a soft promise of violence. Vorian, to his credit, did not falter. He bowed. "Sire, a matter of security. We were vetting the healer's background. There are potential conflicts. For your safety, we determined it prudent to dismiss her." Kaelin took a step into the room. "You determined?" "Yes, my king. The stability of the realm depends on your unassailable strength. This attachment presents a vulnerability that our enemies could exploit." Kaelin was now standing directly before Vorian. He was silent for a long moment, and the silence was more terrifying than any shout. "You speak of my strength," Kaelin finally murmured. "You have served me for 8 years, Chancellor. Tell me, in all that time, have your hands ever stopped trembling in my presence?" Vorian's confident mask slipped. A minute telltale shake in his clasped hands betrayed him. I revere my king. The fear is one of respect." "It is fear," Kaelin corrected, his voice still low. "It is the same fear that laced the touch of every physician you sent to me. It is the fear that turns medicine into another battlefield." He turned his gaze to Alaric. When you looked at my wounds, what did you see? A body to mend, or your own failure if you failed?" Alaric paled, unable to answer. Kaelin looked back at Ilara. "Her hands do not tremble. She sees the wound, not the crown. That is not a vulnerability, Vorian. That is the only true strength anyone has offered me in a decade." The Chancellor saw his entire strategy crumbling. In a desperate move, he played his final card. "And if her strength is a mask?" "My king, we have uncovered something. Her parents were not just healers. They were scribes, record keepers for the old village councils. They documented everything, including the movements of the royal guard before the Black Fang raid." He gestured to a parchment on the table. "One could interpret certain notes as intelligence gathering. We cannot rule out that she is not a mere healer, but a sleeper, a remnant of the old loyalties sent to get close to you when you were weak." It was a flimsy, outrageous claim built on circumstantial fragments, but in the paranoid engine of court politics, it was a spark thrown on dry tinder. Kaelin looked at the parchment, then at Ilara. For a heartbeat, the seed of doubt expertly planted took root. The walls of trust he had just begun to build trembled. Ilara met his gaze. She did not plead, she did not explain. She simply said, "You asked me who I am. I am someone who chooses to heal. You can choose to believe that, or you can choose to believe their fear." The wound on your chest will close either way, the other one that is up to you. She turned and walked out of the antechamber, past the king and down the corridor. Kaelan did not stop her. The conflict on his face was a war between a lifetime of strategic paranoia and a soul-deep newborn hunger for the truth she represented. Vorian pressed his advantage. Let her go, sire. It is the safest course. We will find you a new physician, one properly vetted from a noble line. Kaelan watched Ilara's retreating back until she turned a corner and disappeared. The cold, familiar emptiness rushed back into the space around him. He looked at his chancellor and his physician. He saw not loyal protectors, but men terrified of change, men who would rather poison his only source of peace than adapt to its existence. Get out, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. They scurried from the room. Kaelan was alone. He picked up the parchment Vorian had presented. The notes were mundane, logistical. His analytical mind, trained to see patterns, could find no hidden code, only the desperate scribbles of a healer trying to track the movement of violence to protect their patients. Vorian's lie was transparent, but the damage was done. The hook of suspicion was in his mind. Could it be true? Was the first gentle touch in 10 years a calculated deception? The psychological whiplash was severe. The part of him that was the Alpha King, the survivor, screamed that it was possible. The part that was just Kaelan, the touch-starved man, screamed in silent agony at the thought. He did not summon her back. For 2 days the palace held its breath. The king returned to his throne room, but he was a ghost of his former self. The quiet was back, but it was not the quiet of control. It was the quiet of a deep, internal fracture. Issued orders, he held court, but the life had gone out of his eyes. The physical wounds, without Ilara's care, began to regress. Inflammation returned. A low fever simmered. Alaric, emboldened, tried to approach. Kaelan sent him away with a look that promised death. The king was slowly rejecting all care, and in doing so, he was rejecting the possibility of healing altogether. Roderick, the beater, watched this self-immolation with growing despair. On the evening of the second day, he made a decision. He disguised himself in a common cloak and went down into the lower quarter. He found Ilara's clinic, a modest space between a baker and a cobbler. She was there, treating a child with a burned hand. Roderick waited until she was alone. He is dying, Roderick said bluntly, removing his hood. Not from the wounds, from the choice he made in that room. He is choosing the lie because it is the pain he knows. You are the pain he doesn't understand. Ilara was cleaning her tools. She did not look up. He is the king. He makes his choices. He is a man who felt sunlight for the first time in 10 years and then let his advisors convince him it was poison, Roderick pleaded, his loyalty to his friend overriding protocol. They will kill him with their fear, slowly. They will return him to the empty statue he was, and they will call it strength. You are the only one who looked at the man, not the statue. Ilara paused. Her shoulders slumped. And if I return, the whispers will continue. They will say I bewitched him. They will say I am a spy. Anything good I do will be twisted. My presence itself becomes a weapon against him. Roderick stepped closer. Then let it be a weapon, but let it be his asterisk weapon, not theirs. Come back, not as a healer summoned, but as a truth he has to face. Let him choose, with clear eyes, what kind of king he wants to be. One who rules from a fortress of fear, or one who is strong enough to accept a single, honest hand. Meanwhile, Vorian was not idle. Sensing the king's retreat, he moved to consolidate power. He met with disgruntled border generals, those who disliked the new diplomatic approach. He spoke of restoring the king's martial focus, of eliminating distractions. He did not have to say Ilara's name. They all understood. A faction was coalescing, one that saw the king's moment of humanity as a disease to be purged. The stage was set for a coup, not of violence, but of ideology, a coup to reclaim the king's soul for the old, cruel ways. That night, a cold rain lashed the stone palace. Kaelan stood at the window of his chambers, staring at nothing. The fever was back in full force, a fire in his veins. The wound on his chest throbbed with a sick heat. He felt the pull of delirium, and in that haze, the memory of her touch was so vivid it was a physical ache. He had faced armies without flinching. He could not face this emptiness. It was then he heard the quiet click of his chamber door. He turned, expecting Roderick. It was Ilara. She stood there, rainwater glistening in her dark hair, her simple dress damp at the shoulders. She held her kit. No one had stopped her. Roderick had seen to that. They stared at each other across the dim room. Your beater is a stubborn man, she said finally. He said you were choosing to die of a different kind of wound. Kaelan's voice was raw. Vorian showed me evidence. Did you believe it? He was silent. The truth was he hadn't, not really. He had feared it, which was different. "It does not matter what I believe," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Your presence here is a vulnerability for the kingdom." Ilara walked forward until she was close enough to touch him. She saw the glassy sheen of fever in his eyes, the pallor of his skin. "You told me once that strength was not needing help," she said softly. "I think true strength is knowing what you need and being brave enough to accept it even when the world calls it weak." She reached out, not to his wound, but to his face. Her palm rested against his cheek. It was warm from the rain, solid, real. The contact was a circuit completing. The doubt, the fear, the political calculations, they shattered like glass. A shuddering breath escaped him, and he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. "I do not know how to do this," he confessed, the admission tearing from him. "I do not know how to be touched." "Then we learn," she whispered. In that moment the king surrendered, not to an enemy but to his own humanity. But outside the chamber door a shadow listened. Vorian, making a final nightly check, had heard voices. He peered through the crack and saw the scene, the mighty Alpha King, his head bowed into the hand of the Omega Healer. Not a treatment, a communion. A cold certainty settled in Vorian's heart. The king was lost to them. The old way was over. And if the king would not uphold the kingdom of fear, then new protectors would have to arise. He slipped away into the dark corridor, his mind already weaving a new, more dangerous plot. The gentle touch had healed a king, but it had just ignited a war for the soul of his kingdom. Chancellor Vorian did not sleep that night. The image of the king's surrender was a brand on his mind. In his calculus, the kingdom was now leaderless, adrift in a dangerous sea of sentiment. By dawn, his conspiracy had a name: the Restoration. Its members were few but powerful: General Malcolm, who commanded the eastern garrisons, Alaric, the head physician, and three highborn lords whose power was built on the old, fear-based hierarchy. Their plan was not assassination that would cause civil war. It was a political sedition. They would use the king's perceived weakness, his infatuation with the common healer, as grounds to call a council of alphas. This ancient body, comprised of the heads of the noble houses, could vote to install a regent if the ruling alpha was deemed mentally or physically unfit to rule. They would declare Kalen compromised by trauma and influence, and they would use Ilara as the proof. Orion began drafting the missives, his pen moving with cold precision. He would save the king from himself, even if it meant destroying him. Inside the king's chambers, a different kind of restoration was underway. Ilara tended to Kalen's fever through the night. This time, his resistance was gone. He allowed her to work, and more than that, he allowed himself to be soothed. The psychological barrier was broken. His body, understanding it was finally safe, began to heal with rapid efficiency. By morning, the fever had broken completely, but the healing was no longer just physical. Over the next few days, a new routine established itself. Ilara came and went from the palace freely under Roderick's protection. She treated the king, but their sessions evolved. After the medical work was done, they would talk. She told him of the lower quarter, of the sick who couldn't afford Alaric's fees, of the children with coughs that turned fatal in damp houses. He told her in halting sentences of the weight of the crown, of the loneliness of command, of the faces of young soldiers he'd sent to die for a strip of land. It was a reciprocal healing. She was learning the burden of power. He was learning the reality of his people. Kalen began to issue small, quiet edicts. He ordered surplus palace grain sent to the lower quarter clinics. He commuted the death sentence of a young rogue caught stealing medicine, sentencing him instead to community service in the very clinic he tried to rob. Each decision was a direct result of seeing the world through Ilara's eyes. Each decision was a brick pulled from the wall of fear he had built around his throne, and with each brick removed, Vorian's faction grew more frantic. The Council of Alphas was summoned. The move was a thunderclap across the political landscape. It hadn't been invoked in over 50 years. The noble houses, a pack of powerful, cunning wolves, gathered in the great hall. The air was thick with anticipation and ambition. Kalen took his throne, his body healed, his expression unreadable. Ilara was not present. Vorian stood before the council, the picture of concerned loyalty. "My fellow alphas," he began, his voice echoing, "we gather not in rebellion, but in love for our kingdom. Our king returned from war a hero, but he returned wounded in body, which is natural, and in spirit, which is tragic. In his vulnerable state, he has fallen under the influence of an outsider, a common omega with unknown allegiances. This influence has clouded his judgment. He shows mercy where strength is required. He prioritizes the complaints of peasants over the counsel of his generals. We are watching the unraveling of a great leader, and we have a duty to intervene before the kingdom unravels with him. He presented his evidence, logs of Ilara's clinic treating known rogues, the dubious notes about her parents, and the king's own recent, soft decrees. He painted a picture of a monarch manipulated, his warrior spirit neutered by a clever woman's gentle hands. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the nobles. General Malcolm stood. The eastern factions sent this weakness, my king. They test our borders again. We need the Iron Wolf, not a philosopher king. The trap was sprung. The council looked to Kaelan, waiting for the old response, a roar, a threat, a demonstration of brutal force to reassert dominance. Kaelan slowly stood. He did not roar. He walked down from the dais and stood among them, a move so unprecedented it silenced the room. You speak of my weakness, he said, his voice calm, carrying. You cite my mercy as proof. You see this healer's touch as a corruption. He looked at Vorian. Tell me, Chancellor, when you are sick, does your wife's touch make you weak? When your child hugs your leg, does it diminish your authority in this room? Vorian was caught off guard. That is different, sire, that is private affection. Is it? Kaelan asked, turning to the assembled alphas. Or is it the very foundation of why we fight? To protect those connections, I have spent 10 years building a fortress. I made myself its strongest, most isolated stone, and I was dying inside it. You call her touch a manipulation. I call it the first true thing I have felt in a decade. It did not make me weak. It made me aware that a kingdom built only on the fear of its king is already a corpse. It just doesn't know it's dead yet. He walked to General Malcolm. You want the Iron Wolf to howl at the east. The Iron Wolf is here. But he has learned that a kingdom where a child dies of a curable cough in the shadow of his palace is a kingdom already defeated. So we will meet the eastern threat, with diplomats first, with soldiers if we must, but we will also build hospitals. We will not just defend land, we will improve lives. That is not weakness, that is a harder, more lasting strength. He turned back to the council. You wish to vote on a regent? Vote. But know this, if you choose to remove me for the crime of seeking healing, for the crime of listening to one of our own people, then you are not saving the kingdom. You are choosing the fortress over the future, and I will walk out of these gates with my head high, and I will go build that future elsewhere, with those who understand that true power begins with the courage to be kind. The speech left the hall in stunned silence. It was a complete reframing of power. He had taken their accusation of weakness and transformed it into a manifesto for a new kind of strength. One by one, the alphas began to react. Not all were convinced. But many, especially those with families, those weary of constant war, saw the raw truth in their king's eyes. He wasn't broken, he was awake. The vote was called. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Council of Alphas voted to reaffirm Kaelan as their king. Vorian, Malcolm, and Alaric stood defeated, their plot unraveled before it began. But Kaelan was not finished. The council has spoken. Now I speak. Chancellor Vorian, General Malcolm, Physician Alaric. Your loyalty was to an idea of me that was killing me. For that, you are relieved of your posts. You are exiled from the capital. You may keep your lives and your holdings, but your voices will no longer shape this court. It was a merciful sentence, a demonstration of the very principle he'd just defended. They were led out, not in chains, but in shame. The aftermath was a quiet revolution. Ilara was formally appointed royal healer, with authority over all the kingdom's medical practices. Her first act was to disband the exclusive Palace Physicians Guild and integrate its members with the lower quarter clinics, creating a unified system of care. The king's new decrees, once seen as soft, became the law of the land. Taxes were restructured to fund public health. Diplomacy was given equal weight with military defense. The change was not instantaneous, and there was resistance, but the core had shifted. The final, surprising detail emerged not from a spy, but from an archive. An old scribe, hearing of the new healer's influence, came forward with a fragile water-stained journal. It belonged to Ilara's mother. In it, on the day of the Blackfang raid, was an entry. It described not troop movements, but a desperate treat. The scribe had helped a wounded, disoriented young warrior from the king's own vanguard, hiding him from the raiders. That warrior's description matched a young Kaelan, then a prince on his first campaign, separated from his unit. Ilara's mother had saved the king's life. Long before he was king, she had never known who he was. Ilara brought the journal to Kaelan. They read the entry together in silence. The circle was closed, not with conspiracy, but with a debt of care that had spanned a generation, finally repaid. His healing at her hands was not an accident of fate, but a continuation of a story written long ago. A year later, the kingdom was transformed. The eastern conflict had been resolved through treaty, not bloodshed. The lower quarter clinics were thriving. The palace, once a citadel of silence, now had the quiet hum of purposeful work. Kalen and Ilara walked together in the palace gardens, not as king and healer, but as partners. He took her hand, his touch now sure and gentle. "You asked me once who I was," she said, looking at their joined hands. "I think I finally know. I am the reminder." He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that had become familiar. "And I," he said, "am the listener." The journey from a fearsome, isolated king to a connected, compassionate leader was complete. The gentle touch that undid him had, in the end, rebuilt him, and in rebuilding him, it rebuilt a kingdom. The war for the soul of the kingdom was over. A new peace had begun. So what does this story of a king and a healer, of fear and touch, truly leave us with? It's more than a satisfying reversal of power. It's a neurological blueprint. Kalen's journey maps onto a documented human experience. That prolonged touch starvation doesn't just create loneliness. It actively rewires the nervous system for isolation, interpreting all contact as a threat. His breakdown wasn't a moment of weakness, but a system overload, the body's final, desperate signal that its fundamental need for safe connection could no longer be suppressed. Ilara provided the cure not through complex medicine, but through regulated, predictable touch. Her steady hands acted as a somatic anchor, getting his traumatized system back to a state of safety. This mirrors real-world therapies used for veterans and survivors, where non-sexual, compassionate touch helps recalibrate the body's threat response. The real power wasn't in her defying a king, but in her understanding a basic human mechanism he had been denied. This reframes the entire concept of strength we so often celebrate. We mythologize the impenetrable leader, the lone wolf, the figure who stands apart. But Kalen's story suggests that the most formidable strength might actually be the capacity for integration, the courage to let the guarded parts of oneself be seen and, when necessary, held. His greatest battle wasn't for territory, but for the right to his own humanity, and he needed another person to win it. The lingering question, then, isn't about fantasy kingdoms. It's about our own modern fortresses. Who in your world is playing the role of the alpha king? Who appears invincible, isolated by their own success, power, or trauma, silently starving for a connection they believe would undermine everything they've built? And where are we, perhaps, building walls because we've forgotten how to ask for or offer a simple, steadying hand? The kingdom's transformation from a fear-based hierarchy to a community built on care wasn't a soft option. It was a strategic masterstroke. It created loyalty no weapon could forge and stability no wall could guarantee. It proved that a system which heals its own wounds is infinitely more resilient than one that simply ignores them. This is the ultimate takeaway. Gentleness is not the opposite of power. It is power's most sophisticated evolution. It is the strength to be vulnerable, the strategy of compassion, and the leadership that builds not from the top down, but from the shared, human heart outward. If this exploration of how a single touch can reshape a life and a world resonated with you, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It helps others find this story. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel. We delve deep into the psychology behind the most compelling narratives, uncovering the real human truths that make them unforgettable. Let me know in the comments, what was the moment in this story that landed with you the most? I read every single one. Thank you for watching. Until next time.